In a luxury hotel, a black woman is disrespected by a hotel officer, only to reveal a shocking truth about her identity that leaves him speechless. What happens when a racist officer learns the true identity of the woman he just targeted? This isn't just a case of mistaken identity. It's a lesson in power, respect, and privilege. Before we continue, let us know. Where are you watching from? What do you think will happen next? Sophia Daniels wasn't just another successful woman. She was a self-made billionaire and the owner of a luxury brand that had taken the world by storm. Her empire was built from the ground up, and she carried herself with a confidence that only years of hard work and success could bring. Everywhere she went, she was treated with the respect she had earned. But today, in this high-end hotel, she would face something entirely unexpected. An incident that would challenge everything she had worked so hard for. The confrontation that was about to unfold would make her question not just the person in front of her, but the entire system she'd spent her life navigating. Officer Mark Johnson was a hotel security guard, seemingly friendly and polite as he did his job. He had no idea who Sophia was or what she represented. But as their paths crossed, his behavior began to reveal something much darker. What started as a simple interaction quickly escalated, and the biases he held deep down began to show. At first, it seemed like a misunderstanding, but soon it became clear that his assumptions were leading him down a dangerous path. The luxury hotel where all this took place was an icon of sophistication, its tall windows reflecting the city's shimmering lights. From the outside, it seemed like the perfect place, but inside, something was brewing. Tension lingered in the air, unnoticed by most, but impossible to ignore for Sophia, who could feel it tightening around her as the situation unfolded. Sophia had just finished checking into the luxury hotel, feeling a bit of relief at finally arriving after a long trip. She was used to traveling in style and always expected a certain level of service, especially in places like this. But as she stood in the lobby, admiring the beautiful decor, a figure appeared from the corner of her eye. Officer Mark Johnson, a security guard at the hotel, was approaching her, his footsteps heavy and loud on the polished floor. He wasn't walking with the kind of customer service smile you'd expect in a five-star hotel. Instead, his face was serious, even suspicious. "You're not supposed to be here," Officer Johnson said, his voice raised and intrusive. Sophia blinked, confused for a moment. "This is a luxury establishment, not a place for someone like you." His words hit her harder than she expected. There it was, the cold reminder of the bias he carried. It wasn't even a question or an inquiry. It was an assumption based solely on the color of her skin, something she had faced many times before, but never in such an overt way, especially not in a place like this. Sophia stood still, her eyes narrowing as she took in the officer's words. She had been here countless times, always as a guest, and this was the first time someone had questioned her right to be in such a space. Her jaw tightened, but she remained calm. She knew how to handle situations like this. "Excuse me," she replied, her voice steady. "What do you mean by someone like me? I've been a guest here for years. Your attitude is completely inappropriate." Sophia's heart was racing, but her exterior was calm. She knew she couldn't lose control. She had faced enough of this behavior to know that keeping her composure would be the key to getting through this. The officer's expression didn't soften, though. If anything, he grew even more hostile. "I've seen your type before," Officer Johnson sneered. "You don't belong in a place like this. You've got to leave." His words stung with their blatant racism. It was clear now. This wasn't just about a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a personal attack, one rooted in racial bias that he hadn't bothered to hide. He was trying to assert power over her, to make her feel small, in a place she had every right to be. But Sophia wasn't the kind of woman who would back down easily. She took a deep breath, her mind racing with what to do next. She was taken aback, yes, but she wouldn't let his ignorance dictate her response. Instead of letting the anger rise inside her, she did something she had learned over the years. She kept her cool. She knew that if she handled this situation with grace, it would expose his ignorance more clearly than any emotional outburst ever could. She paused for a moment, allowing the silence to hang in the air. Her heart was pounding, but her face remained calm. "I think it's time you learn who I am," she said, her voice low and firm. The officer blinked, clearly thrown off by her words, unsure of what to expect. But Sophia wasn't done yet. She had had enough. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was about something bigger, and it was time to make that clear. "I'm Sophia Daniels," she said, letting the weight of the words sink in. "I own this entire hotel chain. I'm the reason this place exists, and I'm a person you should never underestimate." For a moment, the officer just stood there, his face turning an unnatural shade of pale. The shock was evident. I didn't know," Officer Johnson stammered. His mouth opened and closed as if he was trying to come up with some sort of excuse, but nothing came. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it like that." But it was too late. The damage had already been done. His prejudices had come to the surface, and there was no taking them back. The real truth had been revealed in that one moment, and there was nothing the officer could say to undo the harm he had caused. His apology was hollow. Sophia wasn't moved by his words. Instead, she turned her attention to the growing number of bystanders who had begun to notice the interaction. The other guests, who had been watching from a distance, started to approach, their voices rising in disbelief at the officer's behavior. "You can't treat people like that," one guest said, shaking their head in disgust. "She's not just a guest, she owns this place." Another person added, "This is ridiculous." Sophia could feel the support of the other guests. Some of them were upset, but others were standing behind her, ready to call out the officer's behavior. And while it might have been tempting to just walk away, Sophia knew that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about sending a message. She looked back at Officer Johnson, her expression still calm but firm. "I expect an apology, and I'll be making sure your actions are reported. There are consequences for this kind of behavior," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that forced the officer to understand the gravity of what had just happened. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about holding him accountable for his actions. And Sophia wasn't about to let him off the hook. Sophia's words rang through the lobby, and the room seemed to pause. Everyone was watching now. It wasn't just about a racist officer being confronted by a powerful black woman. It was about showing everyone in that room that ignorance and prejudice would no longer be tolerated, not even in a luxury hotel. This was bigger than any one person, and Sophia knew it. The situation wasn't just about correcting an individual wrong. It was about sending a message that would ripple out beyond this hotel, beyond this incident. The officer's shock was evident, but there was nothing he could do to undo what he had said. His prejudice had been exposed for all to see, and now the hotel and the world would know. Sophia had stood her ground, and she had taken control of the situation, showing that she would not be intimidated or made to feel less than anyone, regardless of her background. The hotel would be forced to take action, and Officer Johnson would be left to grapple with the consequences of his actions, realizing far too late that he had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. Sophia wasn't going to let this moment pass. Her heart was racing, but she kept her calm. She knew that if she walked away without addressing this, it would be yet another instance where people were allowed to act without consequences. The world needed to see what had happened, to understand that actions like these couldn't be dismissed so easily. "I don't just want an apology," Sophia said, her voice firm but calm. "I want accountability. I'm going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." Officer Johnson flinched at her words, his previously confident stance now faltering. The weight of his mistake began to dawn on him, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage already done. His face reddened, embarrassment mixing with guilt. He stammered, trying to find something to say. I didn't mean to," he said, his voice dropping. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that." But his apology was weak, almost an automatic response to the realization that he had made a huge mistake. It was the kind of apology people give when they know they've been caught, but it lacks any true sense of contrition. Sophia didn't want to hear empty words. The damage was done, and no apology could undo the harm of his assumptions and his racism. "You're not just apologizing to me," Sophia replied, standing tall and unwavering. "You're apologizing to everyone who's ever faced this kind of bias. You need to understand that." Sophia's words hung in the air, stronger than any apology could ever be. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was demanding accountability. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was standing for all the people who had ever been judged, treated unfairly, or assumed to be less than they were simply because of their race. This wasn't just about one officer's behavior. It was about every instance of racial bias that had been allowed to persist unchecked. Sophia could feel the eyes of the other guests on her, but she didn't let that distract her. They were beginning to step forward, some still shocked, others clearly disgusted by the officer's behavior. One guest, a woman in a sharp suit, looked at Officer Johnson with contempt before speaking up. "You can't treat people like that. She's not just a guest, she owns this place." A few other guests murmured in agreement, some nodding. Their voices were soft at first, but as more people gathered, their support for Sophia grew louder. They had been silent observers up until now, but seeing the situation unfold in real time had stirred something in them. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about taking a stand for what was right. The officer, now completely flustered, stumbled back a step. I didn't know who you were," he mumbled, his face pale. Sophia wasn't interested in hearing more excuses. He had made his assumptions about her, and no amount of backtracking could undo what had just happened. "It doesn't matter who I am," she said coldly. "It matters that you treated me differently because of who you assumed I was." Her words cut through the tension in the air, leaving Officer Johnson speechless. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the weight of his own actions. But there was no way to erase the moments he had made her feel inferior, out of place, as if she didn't belong. He was left with nothing but the realization that his actions had exposed his own biases and that those biases had no place in this world. Sophia turned to the other guests, who were now standing together in solidarity. Their faces told the story. They understood. They weren't just witnessing an incident of racial bias. They were witnessing the need for change. She nodded at them before turning her attention back to the officer. "This isn't just about what happened today," she said, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of something much bigger. "It's about ensuring that this kind of behavior is never tolerated again. Not here, not anywhere." Sophia didn't need to make the officer feel any smaller. He had done that on his own. She had made her point. The hotel chain, her hotel chain, was going to take the necessary steps to make sure this didn't happen again. The officer would be held accountable. She wouldn't just let him off the hook with a simple apology or a dismissal of his actions. She had a platform, a voice, and she was going to make sure it mattered. "Your actions will be reported," she said, the finality in her tone signaling the end of the conversation. "And there will be consequences for what you did here today. I won't let this slide." The officer stood frozen, unable to speak, his earlier arrogance now gone. He realized that this moment was far bigger than his position at the hotel. He wasn't just dealing with an upset guest. He was facing someone who could change things, someone who would make sure that this moment didn't go unnoticed. Sophia's heart still raced, but she could feel a sense of relief starting to settle in. The moment wasn't over. There was more to be done. But for now, she had taken control. She had ensured that the officer's behavior would be addressed and that this issue, this larger issue of bias and systemic racism, would continue to be discussed. The guests who had stood in support of her were still murmuring among themselves, some making comments about the situation, while others simply nodded in agreement. The officer's presence now felt insignificant in the face of what had just transpired. They had all witnessed something important, and for many of them, this would be a defining moment. A lesson in standing up against what was wrong, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. Sophia wasn't just changing the course of her own day, she was changing the conversation. And she knew that the fight for justice, the fight for equality, was just beginning. The aftermath of the incident wasn't just about the immediate confrontation. It was about the larger response, the change that was sparked in the wake of Officer Johnson's actions. The hotel had no choice but to act quickly. The news of what had transpired spread like wildfire, both inside the hotel and throughout the city. The hotel's reputation was on the line, and they had to do something to make things right. Within hours, an official statement was issued. The hotel publicly apologized for the officer's behavior, and, as expected, the officer was fired. But that wasn't all. The hotel didn't just stop there. They took steps to implement a new diversity and inclusion program, ensuring that their staff would undergo better training to recognize and address bias. This was something they could no longer ignore. The spotlight was on them now, and they knew they had to show that they were serious about change. But even though the hotel had made the right decision, Sophia knew that this wasn't the end. It was just a step, a small one. The real work was just beginning. The systemic issues that had allowed Officer Johnson to act the way he did weren't solved with a simple firing or a new policy. This incident wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system, a culture, and a mindset that had been allowed to perpetuate for far too long. For Sophia, this wasn't just about retaliation or holding one person accountable. It was about making sure that this incident didn't become another blip in the system's failure to address its deep-rooted issues. She knew that real change took time, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But it had to start somewhere, and she was ready to be part of that change. Sophia reflected on the broader impact of what had happened. Her voice, her actions in that moment, had sparked a conversation that had needed to be had for years. She realized that, in that moment, she had been more than just a guest in the hotel. She had been a voice for everyone who had been discriminated against, belittled, or judged based on their race. The truth was, her story wasn't unique. There were so many others who had experienced similar encounters, who had been treated unfairly simply because of who they were. As she sat quietly in her hotel room, Sophia thought about what had really changed. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a larger cause. The incident had made her realize just how much power one person could have in shifting the tide of a conversation. The spotlight was on her now, but it wasn't about the attention. It was about the change she could bring, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, mistreated, or ignored. Sophia knew she couldn't stop here. She couldn't let this moment slip by without making sure it had lasting impact. This wasn't about one bad officer. It was about ensuring that racism was rooted out from every corner of society. The hotel had taken the first step, but the wider world still had work to do. She thought about the other guests in the hotel who had stepped forward to support her, the ones who had spoken out against the officer's behavior. They were proof that people wanted change. They were proof that people cared about what was happening around them. But what about the places where no one was watching? What about the everyday incidents that went unnoticed? The times when people stayed silent or walked away? Those were the moments that still needed to be addressed. Sophia knew that her actions, though important, were just a part of a much larger movement. She thought about the countless other instances of racism, discrimination, and bias that still plagued society, both inside and outside of institutions like hotels. What had happened to her was only a small part of a much larger issue, and she had to keep pushing for progress, for the kind of world where no one ever had to face such discrimination again. She couldn't afford to be complacent. She had to speak up. She had to continue using her platform, her position, and her voice to fight for a better future. This moment had shown her that silence wasn't an option anymore. She couldn't sit back and let things go on as they had before. The fight for justice and equality wasn't just about being the one who was directly affected. It was about standing up for everyone who didn't have the same opportunities to be heard. Sophia's commitment to fighting for change had been solidified that day. She wasn't just an observer. She was a participant in this larger conversation. She knew that by standing up for what was right, she could influence the way people thought, the way they acted, and the way they treated each other. The battle for equality and fairness wouldn't be won with just one incident or one victory. It was going to take time, persistence, and the collective will of people like her, the people who weren't afraid to speak out, to act, and to push for a society that treated everyone with dignity and respect. In the end, Sophia knew that her fight was far from over. It was just beginning. But she was ready to continue speaking, ready to keep challenging the system, and ready to keep fighting for a world where people like her, people from all walks of life, could exist without fear of prejudice or discrimination. Sophia's voice, her determination, and her ability to turn this moment into a larger movement showed that one person could make a difference. But it would take many people all working together to bring about the change that was needed. This wasn't just about one officer or one encounter. It was about standing up to every injustice, no matter how big or small. It was about saying, enough is enough. Every time we let something slide, We're saying that the status quo is okay, and we know it's not. Racism, discrimination, and bias can be found in every corner of society, and if we stay silent, we're letting it continue. It's about holding people accountable, but it's also about being the change we want to see. Sophia didn't just handle the situation with grace. She turned it into something bigger. This story shows us that when we stand up for what's right, it doesn't just stop with us. It ripples out. It challenges others to think, to act, and to do better. We all have a part to play in making this world more just and equal. We can't let these injustices slide anymore. It's on all of us to speak out, to act, and to hold people accountable for their actions. So, think about it. Have you ever witnessed something like this? Maybe it wasn't in a hotel, but maybe it was in a school or workplace. How do you think we can address racism in public spaces? What do we need to do to make sure it's not ignored? Share your thoughts below. Let's keep the conversation going, because every voice matters. If you believe in justice, if you believe in holding people accountable, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with others. Let's keep spreading the message that real change is possible, and together we can make it happen.